One thing you mentioned, which I think is worth going into even more, is that I think sometimes when tracking comes up, people think immediately, especially in the bodybuilding community, like what are the relevant variables that's going to affect the outcome I care about, and that's what I should track. Kind of the old adage, what's measured gets managed, and you only want to measure the things that are going to impact performance, right? But I think from a broader perspective, and considering that in reality we have a lot of people across kind of the educational spectrum, if you will, of knowledge about nutrition, understanding your habits by tracking is kind of the hidden gem that is probably the most important aspect, especially when you're working with non-competitors or less experienced competitors, or competitors with a background that's a little more traditional, just on like cleaner, unclean food type of thing, and they're transitioning to thinking of foods and their constituent nutrients a little more objectively. I think that educational piece is huge. And when you have people have the ability to track things, what they track is going to become what they value and what they understand and what they get education about. So if you're just having them track macros or calories, that becomes the thing at the forefront of their mind. And as we've come to understand with more and more time in the nutrition space, and looking at nutritional epidemiology and what relates to long-term health, happiness, all that good stuff, we're starting to understand that the overly reductionist approach in nutrition science that we've historically had, it doesn't perfectly explain everything. And while it's probably beyond the scope of this podcast, I would definitely recommend people listen to some of the recent episodes in Sigma Nutrition Radio, that, the public health guidelines of let's reduce sodium, saturated fat, sugar, and some of these things, and control calorie intake. I think those are not bad by any means, and I think those are useful, but they are disconnected from the way people typically think, and people think in foods, not in nutrients, typically in the general population. And foods are more than their constituent parts. One thing I think is quite interesting is if you look at the typical Western diet and you look at the macronutrient breakdown, it's typically a moderate carbohydrate, moderate fat, moderate protein diet. It is also a moderate protein, moderate fat, moderate protein diet, the Mediterranean diet. From a macronutrient perspective, the Mediterranean diet and the Western diet are quite similar, yet they have very different relationships in terms of lifespan and life quality. So there is more to foods than their constituent macronutrients. So if we want to educate our clients about foods, having them just track macros can sometimes get them away from the point. And I would say even myself, as someone who is reasonably well educated about nutrition, when I was just tracking my macros, you would start to think about like, well, what's it matter? If I'm hitting my macros, it's all good, and kind of thinking maybe too reductionist in terms of how I viewed my food. But again, I don't think we're going to hear and have an if it's your macros podcast that's been done for the last decade. But what I do think is important to point out is that this is an opportunity for you to help your clients learn about their habitual intakes and how to change them. And if you want to highlight something mentally or bring it to the forefront for them, you probably want them to track it. So tracking things like vegetables and fruit intake, I think is a really good tool, or whatever else you might want to include in their diet. So that was a bit of a monologue for me, but anyway, those are my thoughts on that. I don't know how you guys feel.
It's interesting when you talk about being like overly zoomed in like that, because I can't tell you like how many times I've had someone come to me who's been tracking macros for years, and I have them switch to like a calories perspective, and they're like, completely lost. Like they can look at a meal and estimate the macro breakdown, but like when you have them start to think about like more zoomed out and think about calories, it's like they've never thought about food like that. And in my opinion, like long-term wise, it's more helpful to know the calories, just to be able to quickly look at the calories and protein of a food compared to like each of the little individual pieces.
Uh,
But I thought that was just
uh-huh.
a cool, like what you just said. I've seen that over and over and over again.
It speaks to how we kind of get locked into the paradigm that we think through and that we practice, because that's what tracking your macros on a regular basis is. And it's funny, I did my whole last contest prep is just calories and protein, and it does shift the way you think about foods and look at things. And I would say it also benefited me a little more from a satiety perspective. I wasn't locked into thinking, oh shit, I only have 20 grams of carbs, but I have 30 grams of fat left. What the hell kind of meal is that? I'm guessing I'm grabbing a bunch of nuts. Um, I was more so thinking, okay, so I have like 400 calories or 500 calories left. what gets me to my protein target that I'm going to feel good about right now, that I'll feel satiated, that I'll be ready to go to bed with. And it just gives you more options and flexibility. And you can think about things from the qualitative side, which I think enhances adherence, or at the very least reduces stress if your adherence is already good, um, and increases the subjective experience of dieting. So, yeah, I think that trade off in most cases is worth it if you have a basis of nutritional habits where you're not going to be veering in wild, ranges in terms of carbs and fat anyway, as an athlete. So yeah, those have just been my experiences.
Yeah, one thing you'd kind of mentioned, Eric, like tracking the calories and protein. Like the last time I competed, it was the same thing, and it's a completely different shift in kind of how you approach things. And I think traditional, you know, back 2010, 2012ish. I mean, a lot of people were still and still do track each individual macronutrient like down to the gram, as if like their success is dictated on whether or not you are hitting these things down to the gram. And I think it's important, anybody that I work with where we're trying to kind of get away from that, it's making them realize like, okay, our expenditure isn't fixed every single day. Like there's no reason to expect success to be predicated off of hitting these to the gram. And so having, like a caloric range and kind of giving yourself some leeway, knowing like, okay, regardless of where I fall within this, plus or minus 100 calorie range, I know I'm a step closer to my goals. It's not, if you're 100 calories over, you're still, in a fat loss phase, you're still going to be in a deficit. And, if hunger was there, it's like you kind of address satiety through that flexibility. But yeah, I think I can't remember the last time I've assigned firm macros to people unless it's like trying to keep a menu more or less not fixed, but within kind of more narrow parameters later in a prep where, there's, if, swings in carbohydrate intake and fat intake, radical changes in those ratios can lead to less predictability in performance. But as a whole, I think it's been good to see, the community kind of coming around to the fact that, calories are what matter the most, and protein kind of addresses you want to call it like the qualitative aspect of what you're gaining and losing to some extent. And from there, there's quite a bit of flexibility.